In the quiet of a forgotten valley, where the air hums with the weight of centuries, a young blacksmith named Kael makes a discovery that will change his life forever. Beneath a cascade of glowing embers, he finds an ancient forge, its stones etched with runes that seem to pulse with a life of their own. Drawn by a passion to craft something extraordinary, Kael ignites the forge, unaware that its flames are bound to a curse older than the mountains themselves. As the fire roars to life, shadows begin to stir in the distance, and what began as a simple dream of forging a legendary weapon becomes a dangerous journey into the unknown. The forge whispers promises of unimaginable power, but with each step closer to its secrets, Kael must confront a choice: embrace its dark allure or risk losing everything he holds dear. And as the embers flicker, a distant horn echoes through the valley, a haunting reminder that the forge's awakening has summoned something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Kael's hands moved with a rhythm born of instinct, the hammer striking the glowing metal in perfect cadence. The dagger began to take shape under his skilled touch, its blade shimmering with an otherworldly light as the runes etched into the forge's stones seemed to bleed into the steel. Each strike of the hammer sent ripples through the air, and the forge itself seemed to breathe, its flames flickering as if alive. But as Kael worked, a low, guttural whisper rose from the depths of the flames, a voice that spoke in riddles, warning of a darkness that had slumbered for centuries. Turn back, it urged, before it is too late. Yet Kael, lost in the exhilaration of creation, dismissed the warnings as echoes of his own imagination. The thrill of crafting something truly legendary was too intoxicating to ignore. As the final rune settled into place on the dagger's blade, a deafening crack split the air. The ground beneath Kael's feet trembled violently, sending tools clattering to the floor. The forge's flames roared to life, their once steady glow now wild and unpredictable, casting jagged shadows across the cavern walls. Kael staggered back, clutching the dagger, its hilt warm and pulsing in his hand. A cold realization crept over him. The forge was not just a tool, it was a prison, and he had unwittingly unlocked its chains. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows outside the forge began to writhe, taking on forms that defied explanation. Now, Kael stood at a crossroads. The dagger in his hand was a masterpiece, a weapon unlike any the world had seen, but its creation had come at a cost. The forge's erratic flames seemed to mock him, their light flickering between brilliance and chaos. Could he abandon the forge, leaving its secrets buried once more? Or would he press on, driven by the promise of greater creations, even if it meant risking the balance of the world itself? The shadows beyond the forge's entrance shifted, their movements deliberate, as if they were waiting for his decision. Kael tightened his grip on the dagger, his resolve hardening. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it head-on, for the forge had chosen him, and its whispers were now his to decipher. The valley seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation, as Kael stepped forward into the unknown. The ground still trembled faintly beneath Kael's boots as he stepped out of the forge, the dagger at his side, glowing faintly with the forge's strange energy. The valley, once serene and untouched, now bore deep, jagged scars, fissures that split the earth like wounds, their edges glowing with veins of an unfamiliar ore. The air tasted of metal and ash, and the sky above seemed darker, as if the very heavens were recoiling from what had been unleashed. Kael moved cautiously, his hand resting on the dagger's hilt, his senses sharpened by the unease that gnawed at him. The forge's whispers still echoed in his mind, tangled with the scholar's warnings. He needed answers, and the valley seemed to hold them. It wasn't long before he spotted a figure in the distance, cloaked in tattered robes and carrying a satchel filled with scrolls and strange instruments. The woman, Lyra, moved with the calm precision of someone who had spent a lifetime seeking knowledge in the forgotten corners of the world. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, met Kael's as he approached, and she spoke with a voice that carried the weight of centuries. "You've awakened it," she said plainly, her gaze flickering to the glowing dagger at his side. The forge was never meant to be found, let alone used. Its power is not yours to command. Kael bristled at her words, his pride flaring. "I've created something extraordinary, something no one else could. Why should I fear the forge when it's given me this?" He held up the dagger, its blade catching the dim light, the runes along its edge shimmering faintly. Lyra's expression darkened, because the forge is no mere tool. It's a relic of an ancient war, a war between gods and mortals, fought over the very essence of creation. The forge was their weapon, their gift to humanity, but it became their curse. It consumed them, twisted their ambitions, and nearly destroyed the world. The gods sealed it away, hoping it would never be found, and yet, here you are, wielding it as if it were just another hammer and anvil. Her words struck a chord deep within Kael, stirring a doubt he hadn't allowed himself to feel. But the forge's whispers were louder now, urging him forward, promising him greatness. "I can control it," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "I can use its power for good." Lyra shook her head, her eyes filled with pity. "No one controls the forge, it controls you. Every creation you make will come at a cost, and that cost will grow with each strike of your hammer. The shadows you've seen, they're just the beginning. The forge's power stirs something ancient, something that should have stayed buried." For a moment, Kael hesitated. The weight of Lyra's warning pressed heavily on him, but the forge's call was relentless, its allure impossible to ignore. He clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. "I'll find a way," he said firmly. "I won't let it consume me." Lyra sighed, her shoulders sagging with resignation. "Then I will accompany you, if only to try and mitigate the damage you've already caused. But know this, Kael, the path you've chosen is treacherous, and the shadows will not wait for you to find your way." As they made their way back to the forge, the valley seemed to grow darker, the fissures in the earth glowing brighter, as if feeding on the forge's energy. The air grew heavy, and the shadows that had once lingered at the edges of Kael's vision now moved with purpose, their forms more defined, more menacing. Kael's grip tightened on the dagger, his earlier confidence faltering as doubt crept in. Was Lyra right? Had he unleashed something far beyond his understanding? The forge loomed ahead, its flames flickering wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced like specters. Kael paused at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices urging him forward, promising him glory, warning him of failure. He glanced at Lyra, her expression unreadable, and then back at the forge. The choice was his, and the weight of it pressed on him like a stone. But as the shadows closed in around them, Kael knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. The forge's runes glowed faintly as Kael and Lyra leaned in closer, their faces illuminated by the eerie light. The symbols were unlike anything either of them had seen before, a complex web of lines and curves that seemed to shift and twist under their gaze. Lyra traced her fingers over the stone, her brow furrowed in concentration. "These aren't just markings," she murmured. "They are a map, a guide to something hidden." Kael's eyes lit up with excitement. A map to what? Another forge, a source of power. The possibilities raced through his mind, each more tantalizing than the last. "A temple," Lyra replied, her tone cautious. "And not just any temple. This one is ancient, older than the forge itself. It's said to hold the key to understanding the forge's true purpose." Kael's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the breakthrough he'd been searching for. If the temple held the answers he needed, he could master the forge, wield its power without fear. "We have to go," he said, his voice firm. Lyra hesitated, her expression clouded with unease. "Kael, this isn't a decision to make lightly. The temple won't be unguarded. There are things that protect it, things that shouldn't be disturbed. Things." Kael raised an eyebrow, his confidence unshaken. "You mean like the shadows we've already seen?" "We've faced them before. We can handle whatever's out there." Lyra shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand. These aren't just shadows. They're manifestations of the forge's power, its corruption. The closer we get to the temple, the stronger they'll become, and the more they'll test you." Kael crossed his arms, his jaw set. "I'm not afraid of a test. If the temple holds the answers I need, then I'll face whatever's waiting for me." Lyra studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in resignation. "Very well, but know this: if we go, we do it my way. No reckless decisions, no rushing in blindly. The temple's guardians won't take kindly to intruders, and we'll need every advantage we can get." Kael nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead, imagining the power and knowledge that awaited them. Together, they gathered their supplies and set off, following the map etched into the forge's stone walls. The path was treacherous, winding through jagged cliffs and dense forests that seemed to close in around them. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows that had once lurked at the edges of their vision now took on more defined forms, twisted, humanoid shapes that moved with unnatural grace. As they pressed on, Kael's initial confidence began to waver. The shadows were no longer content to simply watch. They lunged at him, their forms solidifying into claws and teeth that scraped against his armor. Each encounter left him more shaken than the last, and the whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent. "Turn back," they hissed. "You are not ready." Lyra moved with practiced ease, her movements precise and deliberate, as she fended off the shadows with a staff that crackled with energy. "Stay close," she warned. "They're drawn to your fear. The more you doubt yourself, the stronger they become." Kael clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't afford to falter now, not when they were so close. But as they neared the temple, the shadows grew thicker, their forms more menacing. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The temple loomed ahead, its ancient stones weathered and crumbling, yet still radiating an aura of power. Kael's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the massive doors, carved with runes that matched those on the forge. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. But as he reached for the doors, a wave of doubt washed over him. What if Lyra was right? What if the temple held not answers, but a truth he wasn't ready to face? Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "Once we step inside, there's no turning back," she said softly. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Kael hesitated, his hand hovering over the door. The shadows around them seemed to hold their breath, waiting for his decision. Finally, he nodded, his resolve hardening. "I have to know," he said, "no matter what it costs." With a deep breath, he pushed the doors open, and the two of them stepped into the temple, the shadows closing in behind them. The journey had only just begun, and the true test of Kael's determination was yet to come. The temple's massive doors creaked open with an echoing groan, revealing a cavernous chamber bathed in an eerie, golden light. But before Kael and Lyra could step inside, the ground trembled violently, and a deep, resonant growl filled the air. From the shadows, a colossal stone golem emerged, its body etched with the same runes that adorned the forge. Its eyes glowed with a fiery intensity, and its massive fists clenched as it loomed over them, blocking their path. Kael raised his hands, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "We mean no harm," he called out. "We only seek knowledge." The golem's response was immediate and brutal. It swung one of its massive arms in a wide arc, forcing Kael to dive out of the way. Lyra moved swiftly, her staff crackling with energy as she struck at the creature's legs, but the stone seemed impervious to her attacks. "It's no use," she shouted. "This thing is ancient, too strong for conventional weapons." Kael tightened his grip on the dagger, its blade glowing faintly as if responding to the danger. He darted forward, dodging the golem's crushing blows, and struck at its chest. The blade sparked as it made contact, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening crack, the runes on the dagger flared to life, and a surge of energy erupted from the blade. The golem staggered, its stone body fracturing under the force of the forge's power. With a final, thunderous roar, it collapsed into a pile of rubble. Kael stared at the dagger in his hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The weapon had done what no other could, but the realization sent a chill down his spine. The forge's power was far greater and far more dangerous than he had imagined. Lyra approached cautiously, her eyes fixed on the shattered remains of the golem. "That dagger, it's more than just a weapon," she said quietly. "It's a conduit for the forge's energy, but every time you use it, you're drawing from a well that's not meant to be tapped." Kael nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead. The temple's doors stood open now, and beyond them lay a treasure trove of ancient artifacts, scrolls, tools, and relics that gleamed with an otherworldly light. But what caught his attention was the massive mural that dominated the far wall. It depicted a scene of destruction, a forge engulfed in flames, its power consuming everything around it. Figures human and divine alike were shown fleeing in terror, their faces twisted with despair. Lyra stepped closer to the mural, her expression grim. "This is what they feared," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Forge's power is not just a gift, it's a curse. It doesn't just create, it consumes. And once it begins, there's no stopping it." Kael's gaze lingered on the mural, his chest tightening with unease. The warning was clear, but his ambition clouded his judgment. "Maybe they couldn't control it," he said, his voice tinged with defiance. "But I can. I've already proven that." Lyra turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and frustration. "Kael, look at what happened to them," she said, gesturing to the mural. "They thought they could harness it too, and it destroyed them. You're walking the same path, and it's not too late to turn back." For a moment, doubt flickered in Kael's mind. The mural's warning was impossible to ignore, but the Forge's whispers were louder now, urging him forward. "I can't stop now," he said, his voice firm. "Not when I'm so close to understanding." Lyra sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his determination. "Then we go forward," she said reluctantly. "But know this, every step you take brings you closer to the edge, and when you reach it, there may be no way back." As they ventured deeper into the temple, the air grew heavier, and the whispers in Kael's mind became a constant, insistent hum. The artifacts around them seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their energy intertwining with the Forge's power. Kael's resolve remained unshaken, but the weight of his choices pressed heavily on him. The temple's secrets were within reach, but the cost of uncovering them was becoming all too clear. The chamber narrowed into a long corridor, its walls lined with more murals depicting the Forge's history, its creation, its rise, and its eventual downfall. Each image was a stark reminder of the path Kael was treading, but his ambition burned brighter than his fear. He couldn't turn back now, not when the answers he sought were so close. The corridor opened into a final chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. At its center stood an altar, upon which rested a single, unassuming object, a small, glowing orb. Kael's breath caught in his throat as he approached it, the whispers in his mind growing louder, more urgent. This was it, the key to mastering the Forge. But as he reached out to take it, a cold realization settled over him. The orb wasn't just a tool, it was a test, and the choice he made next would determine not just his fate, but the fate of the world itself. The chamber was silent, save for the faint hum of the glowing orb resting on the altar. Kael's fingers hovered over its surface, the light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. But before he could touch it, Lyra's voice cut through the stillness. "Kael, wait." She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room with a mix of awe and dread. "We need to think this through. This place, it's not just a temple. It's a warning." Kael turned, his brow furrowed. "A warning. This is what we've been searching for." "The answers are here." Lyra shook her head, her expression grim. She gestured to a small alcove hidden in the shadows, where a weathered journal lay on a stone pedestal. Its cover was cracked and faded, but the symbols etched into it were unmistakable. The same runes that adorned the Forge. "That journal," she said, her voice low, "belonged to the last master of the Forge." If anyone can tell us the truth about its power, it's him. Kael hesitated, then crossed the room to pick up the journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded with age, but the words were still legible. As he began to read, a chill crept down his spine. The entries detailed the rise and fall of an entire civilization, brought to ruin by the very forge he now sought to master. The last master spoke of creations that were too powerful, too beautiful, and too dangerous artifacts that consumed their makers and unleashed destruction on the world. Do you see now? Lyra's voice was soft but insistent. The forge isn't a tool for greatness. It's a weapon, and every time you use it, you risk repeating their mistakes. Kael's grip tightened on the journal, his jaw clenching. But what if I'm different? What if I can control it? These people may have failed, but that doesn't mean I will. Lyra stepped closer, her eyes searching his. Kael, this isn't about control. It's about understanding. The forge doesn't just create. It corrupts. It twists your ambitions, makes you believe you're invincible. And by the time you realize the truth, it's too late. Kael's frustration boiled over. You don't understand. This is my chance to create something that will change the world. Something that will make people remember me. I can't just walk away. Lyra's voice rose, matching his intensity. And what if the price is too high? What if you lose yourself in the process? Is that worth it? The air between them crackled with tension, their words echoing off the ancient walls. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their disagreement hanging heavy in the air. Then Lyra turned away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I can't watch you destroy yourself, she said quietly. If you won't listen, then I can't stay. Kael's heart clenched as she walked toward the chamber's entrance, her footsteps echoing in the silence. He wanted to call out, to stop her, but the words caught in his throat. The forge's whispers, which had been a constant presence in his mind, grew louder, more insistent. They painted vivid images in his thoughts, visions of glory, of creations that would make him a legend. Alone in the chamber, Kael sank to his knees, the journal still clutched in his hands. He flipped through the pages, each entry a stark reminder of the forge's dangers. But the whispers drowned out the warnings, their promises too alluring to ignore. I can do this, he murmured, his voice trembling with determination. I won't let it consume me. With a deep breath, he rose to his feet, his resolve hardening. The journal's warnings were clear, but the forge's call was irresistible. He would return to the forge, not as a pawn of its power, but as its master. The visions of glory burned bright in his mind, overshadowing the doubts that lingered in his heart. As he stepped out of the temple, the shadows seemed to part before him, their forms twisting and writhing as if in anticipation. The path ahead was uncertain, but Kael's decision was made. He would prove that the forge's power could be harnessed for good, no matter the cost. And as the temple's doors closed behind him, the whispers grew louder, their promises more vivid, urging him forward into the unknown. The forge's flames roared to life as Kael returned, their light casting jagged shadows across the cavern walls. The air was thick with the hum of ancient power, and the runes etched into the stone glowed faintly, as if responding to his presence. Kael wasted no time. He gathered the finest materials he could find, shimmering ores, rare metals, and fragments of the temple's relics, and set to work. The sword he envisioned would be his masterpiece, a weapon that would surpass anything he had ever created. As the hammer struck the glowing metal, sparks flew like stars, each strike resonating with a deep, primal rhythm. The forge's flames burned brighter than ever, their heat intense enough to make the air shimmer. Kael poured every ounce of his skill and ambition into the work, his hands moving with a precision born of years of practice. The sword began to take shape, its blade gleaming with an unnatural light, the runes from the forge's stones etching themselves into the steel as if by magic. But as the sword neared completion, the forge's whispers grew louder, more insistent. They swirled around Kael like a storm, their voices a cacophony of warnings and promises. And then, in the flickering light of the flames, a figure emerged, a man clad in ancient armor, his face lined with regret. The forge's last master. "Turn back, Kael," the vision said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "This path leads only to ruin. The sword you forge will not bring glory. It will bring destruction. The forge's power is not a gift. It is a curse, and it will consume you as it consumed me." Kael hesitated, his hammer poised mid-strike. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind, but then he shook his head, his resolve hardening. "No," he said firmly. "This is my chance to prove I'm stronger than the forge. I won't let it control me." The vision's expression darkened. "Pride blinds you," he said, his voice fading as the flames flickered. "But the cost of your ambition will be paid by the world." Kael dismissed the warning, his focus returning to the sword. With a final, decisive strike, the blade was complete. It radiated power, its edge shimmering with an otherworldly light. The runes along its length pulsed with energy, and the air around it seemed to hum with anticipation. Kael held it aloft, a triumphant smile spreading across his face, but his triumph was short-lived. Outside the forge, the shadows that had lingered at the edges of the valley began to converge, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in on the cavern. The forge's flames roared higher, their light casting grotesque shapes on the walls. Kael's smile faded as he felt the shadow's presence, cold, oppressive, and hungry. He stepped outside, the sword in hand, and froze. The valley was no longer the serene, untouched place he had once known. The shadows had taken on physical form, their twisted shapes moving with purpose. They surrounded the forge, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Kael's heart pounded as he realized the truth. The sword's power had drawn them, its energy a beacon to the darkness. The forge's whispers crescendoed in his mind, a chaotic mix of triumph and despair. He had created a weapon of unparalleled power, but at what cost? The shadows surged forward, their forms solidifying into claws and teeth. Kael raised the sword, its blade glowing with a fierce light, but the weight of his mistake pressed heavily on him. He had been so focused on proving himself, on mastering the forge's power, that he had failed to see the danger until it was too late. As the first shadow lunged at him, Kael swung the sword, its blade cutting through the darkness with ease. But for every shadow he struck down, two more seemed to take its place. The forge's flames flickered wildly, their light dimming as the shadows closed in. Kael fought with everything he had, but the truth was undeniable. The sword was not a tool of creation. It was a weapon of destruction, and its power had awakened something far darker than he could have imagined. The forge's last master had been right. The cost of his ambition was too high. As the shadows closed in around him, Kael's mind raced. He had risked everything for this moment, but now he saw the folly of his choices. The forge's whispers grew louder, their voices a mix of triumph and despair. They had warned him, but he had refused to listen, and now the price would be paid. Not just by him, but by the world. The shadows surged forward like a tide of darkness, their twisted forms lunging at Kael with claws outstretched. He swung the sword in a wide arc, its blade cutting through the shadows like a blade through smoke. Each strike sent a shockwave of energy rippling through the air, but for every shadow that dissipated, two more seemed to rise in its place. The sword's power was immense, its light blazing against the encroaching darkness, but with every swing, Kael felt a growing unease. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more chaotic, and a strange heat began to spread through his veins, a heat that wasn't from the forge's flames. As he fought, the sword's energy began to seep into him, filling him with a raw, consuming rage. His movements became more forceful, more reckless, and the shadows seemed to feed off his anger, their forms growing larger, more menacing. Kael's breaths came in ragged gasps, his vision narrowing as the sword's power threatened to overwhelm him. He could feel it, the corruption spreading through him, twisting his thoughts, amplifying his doubts. Just as the shadows closed in, a burst of light erupted from behind him. Lyra's staff crackled with energy as she stepped into the fray, her movements swift and precise. She struck at the shadows with a practiced ease, her attacks driving them back. "Kael," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You need to focus. The sword is feeding off your emotions." Kael barely heard her. His grip tightened on the sword's hilt, his vision clouded by the forge's whispers and the sword's growing influence. "I can handle it," he growled, his voice tinged with a bitterness that wasn't his own. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, her tone firm but laced with urgency. "No, you can't. Look at what it's doing to you. The sword isn't just a weapon. It's a trap. The forge's power is consuming you, just like it did to the others." Her words struck a chord, cutting through the haze of anger and doubt. For a moment, Kael hesitated, his grip on the sword loosening, but the shadows didn't wait. They lunged at him again, their claws scraping against his armor, their whispers merging with the forge's chaotic hum. Together, Kael and Lyra fought back, their movements synchronized despite the tension between them. Lyra's staff crackled with energy, her strikes precise and calculated, while Kael's sword blazed with an intensity that seemed to defy the darkness. Yet, even as they drove the shadows back, the forge's flames began to flicker erratically, their light dimming and flaring in unpredictable bursts. The air grew thick with the scent of burning metal, and the ground beneath their feet trembled violently. Lyra glanced at the forge, her expression grim. "The forge is unstable," she said, her voice urgent. "If we don't do something, it's going to explode. The valley, everything will be destroyed." Kael's chest heaved as he stared at the forge, his mind racing. The sword in his hand pulsed with energy, its power both alluring and terrifying. He could feel the forge's influence growing stronger, its whispers promising him greatness, warning him of failure. Destroying the forge would mean giving up everything he had worked for, but letting it continue would mean risking not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Lyra stepped closer, her voice softening. Kael, this isn't just about you. The Forge's power is too dangerous. If you don't stop it now, there won't be anything left to save. The weight of her words pressed heavily on him. He looked at the sword, its blade glowing faintly, and then at the forge, its flames flickering wildly. The choice was his, and the consequences would be far-reaching. As the shadows began to regroup, Kael clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. "We'll destroy it," he said, his voice steady. "But we'll need to act fast." Lyra nodded, her expression a mix of relief and determination. Together, they turned to face the forge, the shadows closing in around them. The final battle was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. The forge's flames roared higher, their erratic light casting jagged shadows across the cavern. Kael and Lyra stood at the center of the chaos, their breaths heavy as they exchanged a tense glance. "We need to seal it," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the urgency. "But the ritual requires someone to stay behind and activate the seal. The forge won't let itself be locked away without a fight." Kael's jaw tightened as he nodded. "I'll do it. This is my mess. I'll be the one to stay." Lyra's eyes flashed with frustration. "No, Kael, you don't understand. The forge's power is already inside you. If you stay, it could twist the ritual, make things worse. You're too connected to it now. Too volatile." Kael shook his head, his voice rising. "And what, you think you're immune? You've been around this just as long as I have. It's not the same." Lyra shot back, her tone sharp. "I've studied the Forge's history for years. I know how it works, what it wants. If anyone can control the ritual, it's me. You're too close to this, Kael. You can't see clearly anymore." Before Kael could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. The shadows surged forward, their forms more solid, more menacing than before. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and the air grew colder, heavier, as if the darkness itself were closing in. Kael gripped the sword tightly, its blade blazing with light as he swung at the approaching shadows. "They're stronger," he muttered, his voice strained. "The forge, it's feeding them." Lyra stepped back, her staff crackling with energy as she fended off the shadows. "That's why we don't have time to argue. The longer the forge burns, the stronger they'll get. We need to act now." Kael's chest tightened as he realized the truth. The forge's power wasn't just a tool or a weapon. It was a beacon, drawing in the darkness and giving it form. Every moment they delayed, the shadows grew stronger, the forge's flames burned hotter, and the risk of disaster grew. He looked at Lyra, his resolve wavering. "If I leave and you stay, what happens to you?" Lyra met his gaze, her expression softening. "The ritual will seal the forge, but it'll take everything I have to complete it. I won't survive." The weight of her words hit him like a blow. For a moment, the chaos around them faded, and all he could see was the determination in her eyes. She was willing to sacrifice everything to stop the forge, to protect the world from its corruption, and Kael realized he couldn't let her do it. "No," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the din. "I won't let you die for my mistakes. This is my responsibility. I'll destroy the forge myself." Lyra's eyes widened. "Kael, you can't. It's too dangerous. The forge's power is too strong. You'll be consumed." "Then so be it," he said, his voice steady. "If that's the price, I'll pay it, but I won't let anyone else suffer for what I've done." The shadows surged closer, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in. Kael turned to face the forge, its flames roaring higher as if sensing his intentions. He tightened his grip on the sword, its blade glowing brighter as he channeled the forge's energy. Lyra reached out, her hand gripping his arm. "Kael, wait. There has to be another way." He looked at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "There isn't, but thank you for trying to stop me." Before she could protest, Kael raised the sword high, its light blazing against the darkness. With a final, decisive strike, he plunged the blade into the heart of the forge. A deafening crack echoed through the cavern as the flames erupted in a blinding explosion of light. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the forge's power was consumed by the sword's energy. Kael felt the heat surge through him, the forge's whispers growing louder, more chaotic, until they became a deafening roar. And then, silence. The forge's flames flickered and died, their light fading into nothing. The cavern was plunged into darkness, the air still and heavy. Kael fell to his knees, the sword slipping from his grasp as the last of the forge's energy drained away. Lyra rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she checked for signs of life. But Kael's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. The forge's power was gone, but so was its hold on him. The valley was quiet once more, the shadows vanished, the forge's corruption sealed away. But the cost had been high. Kael had sacrificed his dream, his ambition, and perhaps even his life to save the world from the forge's darkness. And as Lyra knelt beside him, her heart heavy with grief, she knew that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. The forge's legacy was one of destruction, but Kael's would be one of redemption. In the stillness of the cavern, the only sound was the faint echo of the forge's last whisper, a reminder of the power that had once burned so brightly, and the man who had dared to extinguish it. The cavern trembled violently as Kael and Lyra stood at the heart of the forge, its flames lashing wildly like a caged beast. The air was thick with heat and the acrid scent of burning metal, and the shadows that had once lingered at the edges of the cavern now surged forward in a relentless tide. Kael gripped the sword tightly, its blade glowing with an intensity that matched the forge's erratic flames. But even as he raised it to defend against the shadows, a creeping unease settled over him. The sword's power was intoxicating, its energy coursing through his veins like a drug, but with each strike, he could feel it twisting his thoughts, amplifying his doubts and fears. Lyra moved swiftly, her staff crackling with energy as she fended off the shadows. "Kael, we need to dismantle the forge now," she shouted over the din. "The longer we wait, the stronger they'll get." Kael nodded, his jaw clenched as he swung the sword in a wide arc, its blade cutting through the shadows with ease. But the whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent, urging him to keep fighting, to embrace the sword's power. "I can handle it," he muttered, though his voice wavered. "Just tell me what to do." Lyra's eyes darted to the forge's core, a massive stone pillar etched with glowing runes. "I'll start the ritual," she said, her tone urgent. "But I need time. You have to hold them off." Before Kael could respond, the shadows lunged at him, their forms solidifying into claws and teeth. He swung the sword, its blade blazing with light, but the shadows seemed to feed off his anger, their forms growing larger, more menacing. The sword's corruption was spreading, its energy seeping into him, clouding his judgment. He could feel it, the rage, the desperation, the overwhelming need to prove himself. Lyra reached the forge's core, her hands moving swiftly as she began the sealing ritual. The runes on the pillar glowed brighter, their light casting long shadows across the cavern. But the shadows surged toward her, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in. Kael fought to reach her, his movements growing more frantic as the sword's power threatened to overwhelm him. "Lyra," he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation, but the shadows were too many, their forms too strong. They swarmed around her, their claws scraping against her staff, their whispers merging with the forge's chaotic hum. For a moment, Kael hesitated, torn between completing the ritual and saving Lyra. The sword's whispers urged him to focus on the forge, to finish what he had started, but his heart screamed for him to protect her. And in that split second, he made his choice. With a roar, Kael charged toward Lyra, the sword's blade blazing with light as he struck at the shadows. He fought with everything he had, his movements fueled by a raw, desperate energy. The shadows screamed as they dissipated, their forms dissolving into smoke, but more kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Lyra's voice rose above the chaos, her tone urgent. "Kael, the ritual, it's almost done. We need to." But before she could finish, the shadows overwhelmed her, their forms solidifying into a massive, writhing mass. Kael's heart pounded as he realized the truth. He couldn't save her and complete the ritual. The forge's flames roared higher, their light flickering erratically, and the ground beneath his feet trembled violently. With a final desperate cry, Kael swung the sword, its blade cutting through the shadows as he reached Lyra's side. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the forge's core, but the damage was done. The shadows surged forward, their forms breaching the forge's defenses, and the flames erupted in a blinding explosion of light. The cavern was engulfed in a searing brilliance, the shadows screaming as they were consumed by the forge's power. Kael shielded his eyes, his chest heaving as the light washed over him, its heat intense and overwhelming. For a moment, everything was still, the air heavy with the scent of burning metal and the echoes of the forge's final roar. And then, as the light faded, the valley was silent once more. The forge's flames were gone, their power extinguished, but the cost had been high. Kael knelt beside Lyra, his hands trembling as he checked for signs of life. She was alive, but barely, her breathing shallow and weak. The shadows were gone, the forge's corruption sealed away, but the weight of his choices pressed heavily on Kael. He had saved Lyra, but at what cost? The valley was safe, but the forge's legacy would linger, a reminder of the power he had unleashed and the darkness he had fought to contain. As the last echoes of the forge's whispers faded into silence, Kael knew one thing for certain. The battle was over, but the war within him had only just begun. The explosion's echoes faded into silence, leaving the cavern shrouded in a heavy stillness. Kael groaned, his body aching as he pushed himself up from the ground. Dust and debris covered the floor, and the forge, once a roaring beacon of power, now lay in ruins, its stones cracked and lifeless. The shadows were gone, their twisted forms dissolved into nothingness, but so too was the forge's energy. The air felt empty, hollow, as if a great force had been ripped away. Lyra stirred nearby, her face pale and her breathing shallow. She winced as she sat up, clutching her side, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the remnants of the forge. "We did it," she said softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "The valley is safe." Kael's chest tightened as he looked at the shattered forge. His hands trembled, not from pain, but from the weight of what he had lost. The forge had been his dream, his chance to create something extraordinary, something that would make the world remember his name, and now it was gone. "At what cost?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I wanted to create something beautiful, something lasting, and instead I destroyed it all." Lyra turned to him, her expression softening. "You didn't destroy it, Kael. You stopped it. The forge wasn't a gift. It was a curse. Its power was too dangerous, too unpredictable. If we hadn't acted, it would have consumed everything." Her words were meant to comfort him, but they only deepened the ache in his chest. He had been so consumed by his ambition, so blinded by the forge's promises, that he had failed to see the danger until it was too late. Now all that remained was rubble and regret. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Lyra stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "I need to go," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "There's much to be done, and I can't stay here." Kael looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and gratitude. "Lyra, thank you for everything." She nodded, her gaze lingering on the ruined forge. "Take care of yourself, Kael. The forge's power may be gone, but its influence that's harder to shake." With that, she turned and walked away, her figure growing smaller as she disappeared into the cavern's shadows. Kael watched her go, a hollow ache settling in his chest. He was alone now, the weight of his choices pressing heavily on him. As he stood, his eyes caught a faint glimmer amidst the rubble. Kneeling, he brushed aside the debris, revealing a small, glowing shard of stone. It pulsed faintly, its light weak but unmistakable. Kael's breath caught in his throat as he stared at it. The forge's power wasn't entirely gone. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him: relief, fear, curiosity. The shard was a reminder of what he had lost, but also of what still remained. He clenched his fist around it, the faint warmth seeping into his palm. The forge's whispers were silent now, but the shard's glow was a quiet promise, or perhaps a warning. Kael rose to his feet, the shard tucked safely in his pocket. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for certain: his journey wasn't over. The forge's legacy had left its mark on him, and whether he liked it or not, he would carry it with him. As he stepped out of the cavern and into the valley, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner. The shadows were gone, the threat vanquished, but the weight of his choices lingered. Kael took a deep breath, the faint glow of the shard, a quiet reminder of the power he had once wielded, and the responsibility he still bore. The forge was gone, but its story was far from finished. Kael's return to the village was met with quiet murmurs and wary glances. The once bustling streets felt colder now, the warmth of familiarity replaced by an uneasy distance. The villagers had heard whispers of what had happened in the valley, rumors of shadows and destruction, of a power too great for any one person to wield. They watched him as he passed, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and fear. Kael kept his head down, the weight of their stares pressing heavily on his shoulders. He tried to slip back into the rhythm of his old life, returning to the forge that had once been his sanctuary, but the fire felt different now, its flames dull and lifeless, its heat lacking the intensity that had once fueled his creations. The tools in his hands felt foreign, clumsy, as if the forge itself had turned its back on him. Each piece he crafted was functional, but it lacked the spark, the artistry that had once defined his work. The villagers noticed, their admiration fading into disappointment. Orders dwindled, and the forge grew quieter with each passing day. At night, Kael's dreams were restless, filled with flickering embers and haunting whispers. The forge's voice echoed in his mind, its words fragmented and elusive, like fragments of a forgotten song. He would wake in a cold sweat, the shard he had taken from the ruins glowing faintly on his bedside table. It was a constant reminder of what he had lost and what still lingered within him. Then came the dream that changed everything. Kael stood in a cavern, its walls lined with glowing runes that pulsed with a familiar light. At the center stood the forge's last master, his figure cloaked in shadow, but his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. "You think the forge is gone," the man said, his voice low and resonant. "But its power is not so easily extinguished. It lives within you, Kael, and it can be restored, if you have the strength to face what lies within." Kael woke with a start, his heart pounding. The dream felt too vivid, too real to dismiss as mere imagination. The shard on his bedside table glowed brighter now, its light casting long shadows across the room. He clenched his fists, the weight of the man's words settling over him like a heavy cloak. The forge's whispers grew louder in the days that followed, their voices a constant presence in his mind. They spoke of power, of greatness, of the chance to reclaim what he had lost, but they also spoke of sacrifice, of choices that would test him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Kael wrestled with the temptation, torn between the desire to restore the forge and the fear of what it might cost. Could he trust himself to wield its power without falling into the same darkness that had consumed its last master? The villagers' distance only deepened his isolation. They no longer gathered to watch him work, no longer praised his creations. Even the children, who had once marveled at his skill, now avoided the forge, their laughter fading as they passed by. Kael felt the weight of their judgment, their silent disapproval, a constant reminder of his failures. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forge's fire burned low, Kael sat alone in the dim light. The shard glowed faintly in his hand, its warmth a quiet reassurance, or perhaps a warning. He stared into the flames, his mind churning with questions he couldn't answer. Was the forge's power a gift or a curse? Could he control it, or would it consume him once more? The whispers grew louder, their voices a cacophony of promises and warnings. Kael clenched his jaw, his resolve wavering. The forge's last master had spoken of facing his inner demons, but Kael wasn't sure he was ready for what that might mean. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, and the weight of his choices pressed heavily on him. But one thing was certain, the forge's story wasn't over. And neither was his. The days grew shorter, and the weight of uncertainty pressed heavier on Kael's shoulders. The forge's whispers never ceased, their voices a relentless undercurrent in his thoughts. The shard in his pocket seemed to pulse with a quiet urgency, a constant reminder that the forge's power still lingered, waiting to be reclaimed, or perhaps to reclaim him. One morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Kael made a decision. He couldn't face this alone. He needed someone who understood the forge's dangers, someone who had seen its corruption firsthand. He needed Lyra. The journey to find her took him far from the valley, through dense forests and across rugged mountains, until he reached a bustling city, nestled in the shadow of an ancient library. The library was a towering structure of weathered stone, its walls lined with intricate carvings that seemed to tell stories of forgotten times. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of parchment and ink, and the sound of rustling pages echoed through the halls. It was here, among the endless shelves of ancient texts, that Kael found Lyra. She sat at a wooden table, her hands tracing the delicate script of an old manuscript. Her expression was one of deep concentration, but as Kael approached, her gaze sharpened, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and guarded. "The forge's power is dangerous, Kael. I thought you understood that." Kael hesitated, his hands clenched at his sides. "I do," he said, his voice steady but laced with regret. "That's why I came. I need your help. I can't let the forge's power return, but I don't know how to stop it. Not alone." Lyra studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "And why should I trust you? The last time we met, you were ready to sacrifice everything for the forge's power." What's changed? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Kael took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I've seen what the forge does," he said quietly. "I've felt its corruption, its hunger. It's not a gift. It's a trap, and I won't let it take hold of me again, but I can't destroy it on my own. I need someone who understands it as well as you do." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Lyra sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "You've changed," she admitted, her tone softening. "But the forge's power hasn't. It will test you, Kael. It will try to twist your intentions, just like it did before." "I know," he said, his voice firm. "But I'm ready to face it, with your help." Lyra nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Very well, but we do this my way. No risks, no shortcuts. If we're going to destroy the forge for good, we need to understand it completely." Together, they delved into the library's archives, poring over ancient texts and faded scrolls in search of answers. The forge's history was a tangled web of myths and warnings, its origins shrouded in mystery. But as they pieced together fragments of information, a pattern began to emerge. The forge was not just a tool, it was a conduit, a bridge between the mortal world and something far older, far darker. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the library's lamps cast long shadows across the room, Lyra found what they had been searching for. "Here," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. She held up a parchment, its edges frayed and its ink faded, but the symbols etched into its surface were unmistakable. "This is it," a ritual one that could sever the forge's connection to the world. Kael leaned closer, his heart pounding as he studied the ancient script. How does it work? Lyra's expression grew serious. It requires a sacrifice, she said quietly, not of life, but of power. The forge's energy must be drawn out and contained, then released in a way that breaks its hold on this world. It's dangerous, Kael. If we fail, the forge's power could surge out of control. Kael nodded, his resolve hardening. Then we won't fail. We'll go to the temple ruins, complete the ritual, and end this once and for all. The journey back to the temple was fraught with tension, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on both of them. The ruins loomed ahead, their ancient stones cracked and weathered, yet still radiating an aura of power. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the whispers of the forge seemed to echo through the halls. Kael clenched his fists, his heart pounding as they approached the altar at the center of the temple. The ritual's instructions were clear, but the cost was high. He glanced at Lyra, her expression a mix of determination and unease. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael nodded, his gaze fixed on the altar. "Let's finish this." The ritual began, the air crackling with energy as they channeled the forge's power. The shard in Kael's pocket glowed brighter, its light merging with the runes etched into the temple stones. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but Kael pushed them aside, his focus unwavering. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. And as the ritual reached its climax, Kael knew one thing for certain: the forge's story was about to end. But theirs was just beginning. The journey back to the valley was eerily quiet, the air heavy with a tension that neither Kael nor Lyra could shake. As they approached the forge's ruins, the sight before them stopped them in their tracks. The once shattered stones were shifting, as if guided by an unseen force, slowly piecing themselves back together. The forge's outline was reforming, its runes glowing faintly with an ominous light. Shadows, darker and more numerous than before, writhed around the ruins like a living fog, their forms twisting and surging toward the growing structure. "It's rebuilding itself," Lyra said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "The forge's power, it's not just lingering, it's growing." Kael's chest tightened as he stared at the scene, his hand instinctively reaching for the shard in his pocket. It pulsed faintly, as if responding to the forge's resurgence. "The ritual," he said, his voice urgent. "We have to do it now, before it's too late." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. "But we'll need to work fast. The shadows won't let us get close without a fight." Together, they moved toward the ruins, their steps cautious but determined. The shadows sensed their presence immediately, their forms solidifying into claws and teeth as they surged forward. Kael drew the sword he had crafted, its blade glowing faintly as he swung at the approaching darkness. The weapon cut through the shadows with ease, but for every one he struck down, two more seemed to rise in its place. Lyra moved swiftly, her staff crackling with energy as she fended off the shadows. "Keep them back," she shouted. "I'll start the ritual." Kael nodded, his focus narrowing as he fought to hold the line. The shadows pressed in from all sides, their whispers merging with the forge's chaotic hum. He could feel their influence growing stronger, their cold touch seeping into his thoughts, amplifying his doubts and fears. But he pushed them aside, his grip tightening on the sword. This wasn't just about him anymore. The forge's corruption was spreading, and if they didn't stop it now, it would consume everything. As Lyra began the ritual, the air around her crackled with energy. The runes etched into the forge's stones flared to life, their light casting long shadows across the valley. The shadows shrieked, their forms writhing as they lunged at her, but Kael stood firm, his sword a blazing beacon against the darkness. The forge's whispers grew louder in his mind, their voices a mix of promises and warnings. You could still have it all, they hissed. The power, the glory. You could undo your mistakes. Kael hesitated for a moment, the weight of the whispers pressing heavily on him. He had dreamed of greatness, of creating something that would change the world. But now, faced with the forge's corruption, he saw the truth. The forge's power wasn't a gift. It was a chain, binding him to a path of destruction. With a roar, he swung the sword, its blade cutting through the shadows with a blinding light. I won't let you control me, he shouted, his voice echoing through the valley. The ritual's energy surged, the runes on the forge's stones glowing brighter as Lyra completed the final incantation. The air grew thick with power, the forge's flames flickering wildly as the spell took hold. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the forge's corruption was drawn out and contained. Kael felt the shard in his pocket grow warm, its light merging with the ritual's energy. The forge's whispers grew louder, more desperate, but he pushed them aside, his resolve unshaken. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment to end the forge's legacy, once and for all. As the ritual reached its climax, the forge's flames erupted in a blinding explosion of light. The shadows were consumed, their forms disintegrating into nothingness, and the forge's stones crumbled, their power extinguished. The valley fell silent, the air heavy with the scent of burning metal and the echoes of the forge's final roar. Kael sank to his knees, his chest heaving as the weight of what they had done settled over him. The forge was gone, its power sealed away, but the cost had been high. He looked at Lyra, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion, and knew that their journey wasn't over. The forge's corruption had been stopped, but its influence still lingered, a quiet reminder of the power they had faced and the choices they had made. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, Kael knew one thing for certain. The forge's story was over, but theirs was just beginning. Kael stood at the heart of the forge's ruins, the air crackling with energy as the ritual's final stage loomed before him. The runes etched into the stones glowed brighter, their light pulsing in rhythm with the shard he held tightly in his hand. Lyra stood nearby, her expression a mix of determination and unease. "This is it," she said, her voice steady but laced with caution. "The ritual requires you to channel the forge's power one last time." But Kael, be warned, the strain could destroy you. The forge's corruption is still strong, and it will try to claim you. Kael nodded, his jaw clenched. He could feel the forge's energy thrumming through him, its whispers growing louder with each passing moment. "I know the risks," he said, his voice firm. "But this is the only way. If we don't end this now, the forge will rebuild itself, and everything we fought for will be for nothing." Lyra hesitated, her eyes searching his. "Just be careful. The forge's power is a double-edged sword. It will test you in ways you can't imagine." Kael took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the shard. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the charred ground as he approached the forge's core. The shadows around him stirred, their forms twisting and writhing as if sensing his intentions. He closed his eyes, focusing on the ritual's instructions, and began to channel the forge's energy. At first, it was a trickle, a faint hum of power that flowed through him, steady and controlled. But as the ritual progressed, the energy surged, a torrent of raw power that threatened to overwhelm him. The forge's whispers grew louder, their voices a chaotic cacophony of promises and warnings. You could have it all, they hissed. The power, the glory, you could reshape the world. Kael's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought to maintain control. The shadows surged closer, their forms solidifying into claws and teeth that scraped against his armor. He swung the sword in a wide arc, its blade cutting through the darkness, but the shadows seemed endless, their numbers growing with each passing moment. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, her tone urgent. Kael, you're losing control. The forge's energy is too much for you to handle alone. Kael gritted his teeth, his vision blurring as the forge's power coursed through him. He could feel it, the corruption spreading, twisting his thoughts, amplifying his doubts. I can't hold it, he gasped, his voice strained. Lyra moved quickly, her staff crackling with energy as she stepped into the ritual circle. I'll stabilize the spell, she said, her voice firm. But you need to focus, Kael. Don't let the forge's whispers take hold. As Lyra began to channel her own energy into the ritual, the shadows shifted their attention, their forms surging toward her with a terrifying speed. Kael's heart pounded as he watched her fend them off, her movements precise and deliberate. But the shadows were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Kael's chest tightened as he realized the truth. The forge's power was too great for him to channel alone, but if Lyra fell, the ritual would fail. He clenched his fists, the shard in his hand glowing brighter as he pushed back against the forge's corruption. I won't let you win, he muttered, his voice trembling with determination. The forge's whispers grew louder, their voices a mix of triumph and despair. You can't fight us, they hissed. We are part of you now. Kael's vision blurred as the shadows closed in, their forms merging with the forge's chaotic energy. He could feel his control slipping, the ritual's power threatening to consume him. But then, a voice cut through the chaos, a voice that wasn't the forge's. Kael, Lyra's shout was sharp, urgent. Remember why you're doing this. The forge's power doesn't define you. You are more than its corruption. Her words struck a chord, cutting through the haze of doubt and fear. Kael took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the shard as he focused on the ritual's purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for the valley, for the world, for everyone who had ever been touched by the forge's darkness. With a roar, he channeled the forge's energy one last time, the shard in his hand blazing with light. The shadows screamed as they were consumed, their forms dissolving into smoke, and the forge's whispers faded into silence. The ritual's energy surged, the runes on the forge's stones glowing brighter as the spell reached its climax. For a moment, everything was still, the air heavy with the scent of burning metal and the echoes of the forge's final roar. And then, with a deafening crack, the forge's stones crumbled, their power extinguished. The valley fell silent, the shadows gone, the forge's corruption sealed away. Kael sank to his knees, his chest heaving as the weight of what they had done settled over him. He looked at Lyra, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion, and knew that their journey wasn't over. The forge's story was finished, but theirs was just beginning. Kael stood at the edge of the forge's core, his breath shallow as he stared into the swirling vortex of light and shadow before him. It pulsed like a living heart, its energy radiating a heat that wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that seemed to reach into his very soul. The forge's whispers, once fragmented and chaotic, now spoke with a single resonant voice. "You could be more," it said, its tone both alluring and menacing. "You could wield this power, shape the world as you see fit, become its master, and nothing will be beyond your reach." The offer was tempting, more than Kael wanted to admit. He had dreamed of this moment, hadn't he, to stand at the pinnacle of creation, to forge something that would leave an indelible mark on the world. But as the forge's light flickered across his face, he remembered the cost. The corruption, the destruction, the lives consumed by its hunger. He thought of Lyra, her steady determination, her quiet strength. He thought of the villagers, their wary glances and fading trust. And he thought of the forge's last master, a man who had been seduced by the same promises, only to be consumed by them. The forge's core swirled faster, its light intensifying as if sensing his hesitation. "Do not falter," it urged. "You have come so far. Do not let fear rob you of your destiny." Kael's grip tightened on the shard in his hand, its faint glow a quiet reminder of what was at stake. He stepped closer to the core, his boots crunching on the cracked stones beneath him. The air grew heavier, the forge's power pressing down on him like a physical weight. But this time, he didn't falter. "I won't let you control me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging around him. "Your power isn't a gift, it's a curse. And I won't let it destroy anyone else." The forge's light dimmed for a moment, as if recoiling from his words, but then it surged brighter, its voice rising in a deafening roar. "You cannot destroy me. I am part of you now. To end me is to end yourself." Kael closed his eyes, focusing on the ritual's instructions. He could feel the forge's energy coursing through him, its whispers growing louder, more desperate. But he pushed them aside, his mind clear, his resolve unshaken. He raised the shard, its light merging with the forge's chaotic energy, and began to channel its power into the ritual. The ground beneath him trembled violently, the forge's core swirling faster and faster as the energy was drawn out. The shadows that had lingered at the edges of the cavern surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing as they fought to stop him. But Kael stood firm, his focus unwavering. He could feel the strain, the forge's power threatening to overwhelm him, but he held on, pouring every ounce of his will into the spell. The forge's core began to collapse, its light flickering erratically as the ritual reached its climax. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke, and the whispers grew fainter, their voices fading into silence. With a final, deafening crack, the forge's core shattered, its light extinguished. The flames that had once burned so brightly flickered and died, leaving the cavern in darkness. For a moment, everything was still. The air was heavy with the scent of burning metal, and the ground beneath Kael's feet was littered with the remnants of the forge's stones. He sank to his knees, his chest heaving as the weight of what he had done settled over him. The forge was gone, its power sealed away, but so too was his dream. Lyra appeared at his side, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet admiration. "You ended it." Kael looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and regret. "At what cost?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's gaze softened. "The cost was high," she admitted, "but the world is safer because of what you did. And Kael, you're still here. You didn't let it consume you." Her words were meant to comfort him, but the ache in his chest remained. He had sacrificed his dream, but in doing so, he had saved something far greater. The valley was safe, the shadows gone, and the forge's corruption sealed away. As he rose to his feet, the faint glow of the shard in his hand caught his eye. It was dim now, its light weak but still present. Kael clenched his fist around it, a quiet reminder of the power he had faced, and the strength he had found within himself. The forge's story was over, but Kael's was just beginning, and as he stepped out of the cavern and into the light of a new day, he knew that whatever came next, he would face it with the same resolve that had brought him this far. The forge's destruction left the valley cloaked in an eerie stillness, its once cracked earth now quiet and unmoving. Kael knelt amidst the ruins, his body trembling from the strain of the ritual. His hands, once steady and strong, now shook as he clutched the shard Lyra had handed him. The forge's influence was gone, but its mark remained, a faint, lingering ache in his muscles and a scar that traced its way across his palm, a reminder of the power he had once sought to master. Lyra approached quietly, her footsteps barely audible against the charred ground. She knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she tended to his wounds. "You've done something extraordinary," she said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. Not many could have faced the forge's corruption and walked away. Kael winced as she applied a salve to the burns on his arms, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise. "I didn't walk away unscathed," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "The forge had changed me. I thought I could control it, but it was always the other way around. My ambition, it blinded me." Lyra's expression softened as she met his eyes. "Ambition isn't a bad thing, Kael. It's what drives us to create, to dream, but when it consumes us, that's when it becomes dangerous. You saw the truth in time, and that's what matters." Kael nodded, though the weight of his choices still pressed heavily on him. He glanced at the shard in his hand, its faint glow a quiet reminder of the power he had once wielded. "I don't know what comes next," he said quietly. "The forge was everything to me. Without it, I don't know who I am anymore." Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You're more than the forge, Kael. You've proven that, and whatever comes next, you'll face it with the same strength that brought you here." As the days passed, the valley began to heal. The jagged fissures that had split the earth slowly closed, and the air grew cleaner, lighter. The villagers who had fled in fear began to return, their wary glances and hushed whispers a stark contrast to the admiration Kael had once known. He tried to rejoin their lives, to rebuild the trust he had lost, but but the weight of their judgment was too much to bear. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kael made a decision. He packed what little he owned into a worn satchel, his movements deliberate but heavy with resignation. The valley, once his home, now felt like a prison, a place where he could never escape the shadow of his mistakes. Lyra found him at the edge of the village, his bag slung over his shoulder, and his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "You're leaving," she said, her voice tinged with sadness, but not surprise. Kael nodded, his jaw clenched. "I can't stay here, not like this. I need to find a new purpose, something that isn't tied to the forge." Lyra studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, glowing shard, a fragment of the forge's core. "Take this," she said, pressing it into his hand. "It's a reminder of what you face and what you've overcome. Wherever you go, whatever you do, don't forget the strength you found within yourself." Kael stared at the shard, its faint light reflecting in his eyes. It was a symbol of the power he had once craved, but also of the darkness he had faced and conquered. He closed his fingers around it, the warmth seeping into his palm. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Lyra smiled, though her eyes were filled with a quiet sadness. "Take care of yourself, Kael, and remember sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves." With a final nod, Kael turned and stepped onto the path that led out of the valley. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. The forge's story was over, but his was just beginning. And as the shard's faint glow lit his way, he knew that whatever came next, he would face it not as the man who had sought power, but as the man who had learned to wield it wisely. The valley faded behind him, its scars slowly healing, its people rebuilding, and Kael walked on, his heart lighter, his resolve stronger, ready to carve a new path, one shaped not by ambition, but by the lessons he had learned in the shadow of the forge. Kael's journey took him far from the valley, across rugged mountains and sprawling plains, until he reached a bustling port city, nestled along the coast. The air was thick with the scent of salt and smoke, and the clang of hammers on metal echoed through the streets. Here, he found work in a small forge, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The forge was humble, its walls blackened with soot, and its tools worn from years of use, but it felt like a fresh start. For the first time in years, Kael worked without the weight of the forge's whispers pressing on his mind. He focused on crafting tools, plows for farmers, nails for shipbuilders, and horseshoes for travelers. Each piece was simple yet precise, a testament to his skill and care. He avoided weapons entirely, their creation now carrying a weight he could no longer bear. Instead, he poured his creativity into art, intricate metalwork sculptures, and decorative pieces that brought beauty to the lives of those around him. The shard from the forge, tucked safely in his pocket, served as a quiet reminder of his past. It no longer pulsed with the chaotic energy it once had, but its faint glow remained, a symbol of the power he had faced and the lessons he had learned. Though Kael found solace in his new life, the forge's whispers still lingered at the edges of his thoughts. They were quieter now, more distant, but they never truly faded. At night, when the forge's fire burned low and the city grew still, their voices would return, urging him to reclaim the power he had left behind. But Kael resisted, his resolve strengthened by the peace he had found in his work. One day, as he worked on a delicate filigree for a merchant's daughter, a young apprentice approached the forge. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, his hands calloused but his eyes bright with a hunger Kael recognized all too well. "I've heard you're the finest blacksmith in the city," the boy said, his voice tinged with awe. "I want to learn from you." Kael paused, his hammer hovering above the anvil. He studied the boy, his eager expression, his restless energy, the way his fingers twitched as if already shaping the metal in his mind. It was a reflection of his younger self, a mirror of the ambition that had once driven him to the brink of destruction. For a moment, Kael hesitated. The thought of guiding someone else, of sharing the lessons he had learned, felt daunting. But as he looked into the boy's eyes, he realized that his journey had prepared him for this very moment. He had faced the forge's corruption and walked away, not unscathed, but wiser. And now he had the chance to help someone else avoid the same mistakes. "What's your name?" Kael asked, setting down his hammer. "Eamon," the boy replied, his voice steady despite the flicker of nervousness in his eyes. Kael nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Well, Eamon, if you're serious about learning, you'll need to start with the basics. But I'll warn you, this isn't just about shaping metal, it's about shaping yourself." Eamon's eyes widened, but he nodded eagerly. "I'm ready." As the days turned into weeks, Kael began to teach Eamon the art of blacksmithing. He started with the fundamentals: how to temper steel, how to rid the fire's heat, how to listen to the metal as it took shape. But he also shared the lessons he had learned the hard way: the dangers of unchecked ambition, the importance of humility, and the value of creating not for glory, but for the good of others. Eamon proved to be a quick learner, his hands steady and his mind sharp. But Kael could see the same hunger in him that had once consumed his own heart. It was a hunger for greatness, for recognition, for something more. And though Kael understood it, he also knew how easily it could lead to ruin. One evening, as they worked together on a set of tools for a local carpenter, Eamon broke the silence. "Master Kael," he began, his voice hesitant, "you've created so much. Why do you avoid making weapons? You could be famous, rich even, if you wanted." Kael set down his tongs, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers of the forge. "Weapons have a way of changing people," he said quietly. "They're not just tools, they're symbols of power. And power, it has a way of twisting even the best intentions. I've seen what it can do, Eamon. I've felt it." Eamon frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "But isn't it the same with any creation? A tool, a sculpture? They all have power, don't they?" Kael nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "You're right. But the difference is in how we use that power. A tool can build, heal, create. A weapon, it can only destroy, and destruction has a way of leaving scars that never truly heal." Eamon fell silent, his gaze drifting to the shard that Kael kept on a shelf above the forge. Its faint glow seemed to pulse in the dim light, a quiet reminder of the power they both knew it held. As the weeks turned into months, Kael watched Eamon grow, not just in skill, but in understanding. The boy's ambition remained, but it was tempered now, shaped by the lessons Kael had shared. And in teaching Eamon, Kael found a new sense of purpose. The forge's whispers still haunted him, but they no longer held the same power over him. He had found a way to channel his past into something meaningful, something that could help others avoid the same mistakes. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Kael felt a sense of peace. The forge's story was over, but his was still being written. And as he worked alongside Eamon, he realized that perhaps the greatest creation of all was the legacy he was leaving behind, not in the metal he shaped, but in the lives he touched. Years later, the name Kael has become synonymous not with destruction, but with wisdom and artistry. His small forge, tucked away in the bustling port city, has grown into a sanctuary for aspiring blacksmiths and artisans. The tools and sculptures he creates are celebrated not for their power, but for their precision and beauty, a testament to the lessons he learned in the shadow of the forge. The shard he once carried, now displayed on a simple wooden shelf, serves as a quiet reminder of the darkness he faced and the strength he found to overcome it. Kael often finds himself standing at the edge of the forge, watching the flames dance as they did in his youth, but the whispers that once haunted him are silent now, replaced by the steady rhythm of hammers and the laughter of his apprentices. Among them is Eamon, now a skilled blacksmith in his own right, his hands steady and his spirit tempered by the wisdom Kael imparted. The hunger for greatness still burns in Eamon's eyes, but it is balanced now, shaped by the understanding that true mastery lies not in the pursuit of power, but in the choices we make. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forge's fire burned low, Kael sat with Eamon, sharing stories of his journey. "The forge taught me many things," he said, his voice tinged with reflection. "But the greatest lesson was this: power is not in what we create, but in the decisions we make along the way. Every strike of the hammer, every choice we face, it shapes not just the metal, but who we are." Eamon listened intently, his gaze fixed on the shard's faint glow. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly, leaving the valley, giving up the forge's power. Kael smiled, a warmth in his eyes that spoke of hard-earned peace. "Regret? No. I've learned that some things are worth more than power. The people we help, the lives we touch, that's the true measure of a legacy." As the years passed, Kael's influence spread far beyond the walls of his forge. The valley, once scarred by the forge's corruption, now thrived with new life. The villagers who had once feared him now spoke of him with reverence, their children growing up on tales of the blacksmith who faced the forge's darkness and emerged stronger. His story became a bedtime tale, whispered in the quiet of the night, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the strength of redemption. Kael often returned to the valley, not as a master of the forge, but as a mentor and friend. He would walk among the people, his hands rough from years of work, his heart light with the knowledge that he had turned his greatest failure into a legacy of hope. The forge's ruins, now overgrown with vines and wildflowers, stood as a quiet testament to the past, a reminder of what had been and what could have been. And as he stood there one last time, the wind carrying the scent of blooming flowers and the distant sound of laughter, Kael felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had led him here, to a life of purpose, of connection, of quiet strength. The forge's whispers were gone, but their lessons remained, etched into his heart like the runes on an ancient blade. As he turned to leave, Eamon by his side, Kael glanced at the shard one last time. Its glow was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A quiet reminder of the power he had faced and the choices he had made. And as the sun set on the valley, casting long shadows across the land, Kael knew that his story was no longer just his own. It was a story of redemption, of hope, of the enduring strength of the human spirit. And that, he realized, was the greatest creation of all.